Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I am Paul Morrow here on the ops desk. I'm flying solo today without my colleagues, but that's okay because we really have a special guest. Very, very excited to have Garry McCarthy. What a career. Former Deputy Commissioner of Operations at NYPD. Top person in Newark. I think you were the, Commissioner of Public Safety, I want to say, Garry?
No, the title there is actually police director. It's the equivalent of the commissioner.
Okay, so police director, excuse me. Then Chicago is superintendent, correct? That's the top guy?
That's correct. I've been a chief, a superintendent, a director,
and now you have Willow Springs. What's the top title there?
Chief.
All right, so all excuse me, all of those are the top spot in these respective organizations. So a ton of experience there. We're lucky to get them. That said, now you've been in policing since 1981. Nobody is going to have the insight you have regarding Chicago. Chicago, much in the news these days. I'm going to ask you a very blanket question. What the hell is going on in Chicago?
Well, Paul, when my friends across the country ask me what's wrong with Chicago, my simple answer is Chicago politics. They don't do things in a fashion that is going to create excellence and make it last for a long time. I had the great fortune to go up through the NYPD. I mean, I was a cop in the 4-6 precinct up in the Bronx, which is a pretty tough neighborhood.
Sure.
Sergeant in the 4-3, lieutenant in the 4-4. So I did some hard time, and I got to learn the street. And in the NYPD, as you know, sergeant, lieutenant, captain are tests. And after that, it's appointment. So I thought my career was over when I made captain. And it turns out I got very fortunate. I got pushed up in front of Howard Safer, Bill Bratton, and Rudy Giuliani a couple of times. And I ended up getting recognized. But to move ahead, I had 3 separate precinct commands. I had the 2-0 for 2 years. I had the 3-3 in Washington Heights for 2 years. And I actually had the 7-0 for a year after the Louima scandal.
Oh, I was there. Actually, I must have just missed you. When I got there, it was Diaz.
Right, Ray Diaz. I followed Ray. And then I became deputy commissioner. But in Chicago, I describe it as a game of chutes and ladders. There's no executive development. It's all about who's in and who's out. And if you're in, then you get on a ladder. And if you're out, then you get on a chute and you're out. So we brought something called a career path to Chicago PD and, went through patrol. Being a district commander to districts here in Chicago was the step into the next level of the department. And it was working out really well. And they didn't even have executive officers here. They didn't have people who, if the commanding officer was on vacation, was in charge. So we put captains in those positions, and those were the guys and gals who were going to ascend to the next level and take over when those folks moved up.
So hold on. So they literally didn't have a situation where you had a commanding officer and an XO, in other words, the number 2, who could fill the gap when the top person in the unit was MIA for some reason.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct. So, there was so many structural issues based upon my experience in New York, which was obviously fantastic. I think about 1989 when I was a lieutenant in the 4-4, and we had 13 police-related shootouts in the first 11 months that I was there.
Wow.
The place was out of control. And then I think fast forward to, the years when Mayor Giuliani came in and brought in Bill Bratton and Howard Safer and Ray Kelly came back. I mean, we did very well for a very long time. Sure. And that was based on good structure, good policy, and good supervision.
Double digit crime drops every year, continuing beyond which beyond the point where many people had said, well, it can't go any lower. I mean, I was there for that. As I came in 97, people were saying, well, God, it's so much better than it was just a couple of years ago. It can't, and yet it kept going down through the early aughts and even into the 20 teens. And then, of course, we got Bill de Blasio, a whole nother story. So why is it? Why was it that Chicago was so structurally unsound? And were you able to fix a lot of that?
Yeah, we were able to fix a lot of it. I mean, Rahm Emanuel brought me in, and the
He
interesting
was
thing
mayor of
about Rahm
Chicago at the time.
as mayor of Chicago, yeah.
Right.
And the interesting thing about Rahm Emanuel is that he was all law and order
Mm,
until he wasn't, and he had to save his butt politically.
right.
So, it's funny, he talked about the Ferguson effect on policing and what was happening in Chicago. But at the same time, and he said that the police went in, curled up in a ball rather than go out and do their job. Yet that's exactly what he did.
Right.
And at the end of the day, he turned political. And, we got to 1964 murder rates in Chicago when I was
Mm.
superintendent in 2014.
So it can be done.
Oh, yeah. Oh, 5 years I was here. And every year crime went down, police-related shootings went down,
Yeah.
complaints against cops went down.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we did it by making 30,000 less arrests.
Yeah.
When I got here, there was a policy in the department, they would say, go get me a head. In other words, go out and lock somebody up. We don't
Yeah.
care what you lock them up for, but lock somebody up.
Right.
And we know that's not the answer. The
Yeah. Of
answer
course
is
not.
arrest the right person at the right time, at the right place for the right
Sure.
reason, right? And then get a
Data-driven,
good prosecution.
intelligence-led policing is fancy terms, but it is comes down to what you're saying. Lock up the right people at the right times.
Right. So I'm gonna skip around a little bit, so forgive me. And you mentioned data-driven policing, which is exactly what we did. We came up with a strategy to the vast majority of the violent crime in Chicago is gang related.
Right.
And when I talked about New York gangs, I used to say that those gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, are the unionization of the narcotics trade. In other
Mm.
words, you're a Blood today, you're a Crip tomorrow. It all depends on your street corner and who you're working with.
Right.
Here, it's gang violence based upon where you're born and raised. There are kids in a crib who are going to be Latin kings because their dad's a Latin king and the grandfather was a Latin king. And
Sure.
it's generational hatred of other gangs.
Right.
So we stole a page from Los Angeles. I had the opportunity to befriend Charlie Beck, a very good friend of mine at this point, and a whole bunch of other people through Major City Chiefs. And the thing that I learned from LA was as soon as the shooting happened, they were looking at where's the retaliation going to happen.
Mm.
And what we found in Chicago is retaliation was happening within 6 minutes sometimes.
Wow.
So we collected the data. We went around the city and we identified as many gang members as we could, as many gang turfs as we could, and as many gang disputes as we could.
Mm-hmm.
We knew
Mm-hmm.
that this gang was in conflict with this gang. So if subject A in the Red Hot Chili Peppers gets shot over here, we know that they're in conflict with the Tower Boys over here.
Right.
And we don't deploy everybody to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. We go to the Tower Boys,
Right.
where the Chili Peppers are going to go shoot somebody.
And you're probably preventing another homicide or certainly another shooting or series of shootings.
Correct. And the problem is the gang database came under attack from the left,
Yeah.
from the radical
They
left.
hate
I'm
that
even
thing.
gonna call them.
It's too effective for them. Yeah.
Yeah. And when Lori Lightfoot came in, they eliminated the gang database. Well, you can't do data-driven policing without data.
Right.
So
And
now they kind of
they did the same thing here in New York. You know, there's a whole litany of instances where they've done that kind of thing where, you know what, the data is driving the policing, it's actually working. And so then they decide, you know what, the data is racist, it's institutionally racist, it is being collected in a racist way. So then you change it. And then whatever you change it to, if that's still effective, they're going to make the same allegation. They did that with the stop, question, and frisk stuff. So I want to segue into that because I read your paper. You wrote a very insightful paper that I really think sums it up. And I want to give a quote from that paper. And I know it's a little dated, but it's nonetheless completely relevant till today. What we call data-driven policing, DOJ calls systemic racism. So can you tease that out for us? Because I think that encapsulates a lot.
Sure, and the charts in that paper kind of show it. DOJ wants us, and this is kind of amusing, that they want us to do our enforcement based upon a city's demographics, right?
Mm,
So, for argument's sake, and this is not exact numbers, Chicago is basically a third, a third, and a third. a third Hispanic, a third Black, and a third white. That's general terms, okay? Englewood, one of the most violent districts in
High
the
crime,
city,
sure.
is 98% African American.
Right,
So, do you want us to stop white folks a third of the time in Englewood? And
right,
what would be the effect on crime?
right,
And it would have no effect because those two or three white guys would get
right,
stopped 20, 30 times. And by the way, if we stop people based upon population demographics, I'm sure that the Supreme Court would say that that's unconstitutional.
right,
Because what we do is we stop people based upon crime data.
sure.
And we did a 2-year breakdown of crime in the city of Chicago, not a small sample, 2 years worth of crime. And in every one of the 77 neighborhoods in the city of Chicago in 2013 and 2014, within 1 or 2 percentage points, we were right on the mark for crime data. In other words, descriptions of the offenders or the
Yeah,
purposes, say in New York,
yeah,
or arrests
yeah,
for murder, rape, and robbery. So the part that really people kind of lock onto is, so that's Englewood. Go to Lincoln Park, which is kind of an exclusive neighborhood here in Chicago. It's only 8% African American residents, yet we were stopping 56% African Americans. Well, there it is right there. That's systemic racism because those folks don't live there, but you're stopping them when they go there. The crime data said that 58% of the time, victims identified African Americans as the offenders.
right,
So we were 2% below it. What we found was the only demographic in the city of Chicago that was being disproportionately stopped based upon crime data and arrests were white folks,
right.
which is kind of ironic, isn't it?
And in
So,
fact, what people don't realize is that the stops are not like arbitrary in the sense that you say, okay, here comes a black guy, I'm going to stop him. You're going to have reasonable suspicion because it's all done under federal law. Terry stops, without getting all involved in Terry v. Ohio, famous case. But there is indicia before the stop occurs. And so it's articulatable that there is a reason for that stop. And here in New York, when we had a similar accusation thrown at the police department, and that was under the Bloomberg-Kelly regime, there had been tens of thousands of stops. The case was based on 6 stops. I had that from Ray Kelly himself. I was at a thing that he was speaking at. We talked 6 stops. And in fact, the case went up on appeal. The judge got annihilated at the appeals level. Shara Scheinlin, notoriously anti-cop. She was all but sanctioned for being having anti-police bias. All they had to do was let that case go forward, and the entire thing would have got thrown out. Bill de Blasio came in, dropped the case, and as a result, it is now received wisdom on the left here in New York, which is most of New York. The New York Times leads the charge that, of course, the stops were unconstitutional, and the NYPD was engaging in unconstitutional stops, and they just get the result that they want, and then, you know what? It becomes gospel. Am I wrong?
no, you're absolutely right. But I want to add one thing to it. You don't want to get into Terry versus Ohio, but it's important to understand that this is a Supreme Court decision. This
Right.
is not the policy of Department of Justice, or at
Federal
least
law. Yeah.
wasn't under the 8-year run of,
Yeah.
I hate to say it, Obama.
Under
You know,
Obama,
I
of
met
course,
with
we
a
could
number
say
of
it.
times,
Sure.
charismatic, smart guy, very intelligent, had great conversations with him. But when the Department of Justice said that they were going to come to Chicago to investigate the police, the press naturally came to me and said, well, what do you think they're going to say? I said, they're going to say that we have systemic racism, poor training, and poor supervision.
Right.
He said, well, why do you think that's going to be? Because in the last 27 investigations that they did, that's what they found.
Sure. And then they put you under a federal monitorship. And then a
Correct.
friend of theirs gets the deal to be the monitor, always a connected law firm. Those checks get cashed like clockwork. It's one of the biggest scams in the police, federal enforcement, civil arena. These law firms, they get the ticket to be the monitorships. They're all dying to get it because as a law firm, there's no better check that comes in like clockwork that's going to clear than a check from the federal government. And in NYPD, as a result of the case I was talking about earlier, a federal monitorship was put in place. It's still going on.
Paul, let me just get this in real quick. Same thing here in Chicago. It's been going on for 9 years.
Yeah,
And people need to understand that it's the monitor who determines when there's substantial compliance
right,
with the investigations that they want.
right.
So that's akin to me and you saying, okay, we're going to determine when we get ourselves fired.
Right, exactly.
Nobody
You
would
know,
do it.
it's ridiculous. Of course, yeah. You're gonna want. I'm gonna put in a report that's going to result in my own termination. Of
Yeah,
course not. And I've written about this. It is again. It's just an ongoing scam, and it's one of those things that I hope that, frankly, the Donald Trump Doge takes a look at because whether you like that thing or don't like that thing, this has been a disservice to policing and a disservice to the population that's supposed to be served by it.
absolutely.
So let me go back to what I was transitioning to because I know we have a hard out. I want to talk real quick about the migrant crisis. Now, you and I talked about a case that is much in the news in Chicago, a terrible case. Two migrants went on Grindr, which is a gay dating app, showed up with duct tape. So you know it was in their heads. Took this guy, taped him, looks like he was tortured, and they ultimately, allegedly, murdered him. And it turns out, you know the neighborhood, don't you?
Yeah, it's about a half a mile from where I live.
So a nice neighborhood,
Unfortunately,
and we had this
very
horrific
nice
crime.
neighborhood.
What
Yeah.
what's the attitude in Chicago? Because it just came down today that Donald Trump's DOJ is suing Chicago. I assume DOJ. I know the
Yeah.
administration is suing Chicago and Illinois because of their sanctuary city status. So it looks like they're going to make Chicago and Illinois the poster child for this to see how it goes. And if they gain some purchase, which I suspect they will, that's going to be farmed out to a lot of other cities. What's the feeling on the ground there regarding this?
Well, I can tell you that 90+% of the people who I speak to can't wrap their head around the fact that we have an open border or
Yeah.
had an open border, right? That
Mm-hmm.
millions of people come here and they're getting supported by the government.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the African American community here, they are up in arms about the migrants.
Yeah. Here too.
If,
Yeah.
if the state and the city can find all this money to support these migrants, why couldn't they find that money before and put it into programs that we could have used with the police,
Yeah.
working with the community to reduce crime?
Yeah.
So that's the overwhelming feeling of anybody I speak to, almost anybody. There's some people who, as soon as you start to talk to, you realize you can't continue the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, my wife and I joke, we have an 8-year-old, believe it or not. At my age, I have an 8-year-old. And during the sit-ins at the colleges, I'm looking around and I see Northwestern, you know, suddenly is occupied. I'm like, all right, check that off the list. I guess we can't send them to Northwestern.
Yeah.
And then I see University of Chicago
Yeah.
gets overrun, and okay, we can't send them there. Um, and then I see Columbia goes up. I'm like, all right, we're not sending them there. I said, you know what? At least we got Fordham.
Yeah.
And so the Fordham kind of had some issues too. And I'm like, I don't want to send my son to school for indoctrination.
Yeah.
Know, the people who engage in these theoretical things um, probably don't have the practical experience on the street. How many
No.
crime scenes have they been to? How many guns have they taken away from
Oh,
criminals?
have you
How
ever
many
made a
times have
case?
they
Yeah.
heard gunshots?
Of course. Of
And
course. And they're sitting in
Paul,
judgment of us.
Paul, one thing that I'm going to add to it, I'm quite prejudiced about this one because I lost a daughter to fentanyl.
Right. I was going to get to
It's
that. So go ahead.
it's the story that everybody's heard 1,000 times. She was a four-sport athlete in high school, got into a car accident, her ankle got pulverized. And as a result, they loaded her up with OxyContin.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't even remember how many operations she had, probably about 6 or so.
Wow.
I don't remember how many times we got her into rehab or how many people tried to help her.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, she died uh, May 29th, 2022. And, you know, I'm a big history buff. And, you know, I read a statistic, and I'm not sure it's accurate, but In 2022, they said there were about 110,000 opioid deaths here in the United States.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by the fact that in a 10-year war in Vietnam, we lost 58,000 Americans
Yeah.
over 10 years,
Yeah.
almost half the number that we lost in 2022 to opioids, including primarily fentanyl.
Yeah.
And it really occurs to me that, and you're a lawyer and a police officer, so you know this, if somebody shoots into a crowd with a gun, that's reckless, and you can be prosecuted and should be prosecuted for murder,
Yeah.
right? There is 100% chance if you sell a batch of fentanyl to somebody that somebody's going to die.
Yep.
A 100% chance.
Yep.
Every one of those fentanyl deaths should be investigated as a murder and they should be charged. But that's only one thing. They could do that now. They don't have
Yeah.
to make up a new law for that
Yep.
because shooting into a crowd, you know you're going to kill somebody. You should expect that you're going to kill somebody. Selling fentanyl, you should expect that you're going to kill somebody. That could be
Absolutely.
prosecuted now.
Yep.
But there still needs to be something else that if you get caught in possession of fentanyl, it's akin to rat poison that you're selling to somebody to kill them.
Sure. Yeah.
So, obviously I have my guilt as a father who lost my daughter. Um, she would be 38 years old right now. And it's the worst thing I've ever experienced. And
So
I'm not the only person out here.
I was about to say, you're speaking, and we're so sorry to hear it because, you know, this is a very common story. This is one of the things that Tom Homan name checks regularly. He uses an even bigger number, and he talks about the fact that the cartels who are dealing this stuff, and my friend Derek Maltz, who just got DEA, acting head of DEA, I'm sure he'll be confirmed. He made a career of talking about this for years, and that's how he got this spot. He's former DEA. That the cartels have killed exponentially more people than all the terrorist attacks on America combined, including 9/11. So when you use that metric, the fact that we've sat still for this, and I have, by the way, seen the argument made by prosecutors to do exactly what you're talking about. If you look at the recent case that came out of someplace in the Midwest, I forget the city, where the parents were charged with manslaughter because they let a son who very clearly had some mental issues have one of their guns. He had access to the gun. He had it on them when they had a parent-teacher conference and ultimately went on a shooting spree. Well, they extended the law there, and they charged what a reckless standard. Here in New York, it would likely have been criminally negligent homicide. But you can get a manslaughter or negligent homicide charge out of that kind of thing. And I go back to what the chief of detectives here in New York said about a year ago. Every drug being sold in New York, every illegal drug being sold in New York has at least some fentanyl in it because it's a force multiplier. It makes it stronger, it's cheaper, and it causes addiction. So if you're buying cocaine or you're buying even heroin or something else, crystal meth, it's going to have some fentanyl in it. And Eric Maltz makes the point that these kids aren't ODing. They're being poisoned. There's a difference.
They're being murdered.
They're being
Yeah.
murdered. And that's the term that he uses. They're being poisoned and killed. And that is a significant distinction, and it should be charged that way. And yet we don't do it. And not only don't we do it, but we have been inviting these people in and providing for their care and feeding. It's just such willful blindness. And, it looks like things are going to start to change with the new administration in Washington, but there are people like Brandon Johnson in Chicago who are just so dug in against it. So I got to ask you, could Brandon Johnson, in light of everything that's going on in Chicago, in light of some of these crimes that are making the news and TDA being all over the place, I talked to TDA members. I was out there for Fox for the Democratic Convention and talked to guys who were blatant gangbangers. I was told that they told us Chicago PD told them, look, clear out of Midtown here for a while, but after the convention, you can come back. So I want to get to Brandon Johnson. You've had your experience with the mayors out there going from Rahm Emanuel, who completely just folded, and we all know that. Then we got Lori Lightfoot. People thought it couldn't get worse. It did. Could Brandon Johnson be reelected out there?
Well, I would be shocked, but you know what? I'm never surprised. And you probably haven't been following this, but Brandon Johnson actually was a school teacher, right?
I know.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I understand that he didn't spend a lot of time teaching. He became an administrator.
Yeah.
That's irrelevant. But his relationship with the Chicago Teachers Union, and I
Right.
know a lot of people who are teachers here, and they're really good people, right?
Yeah.
I'm not affiliating with people who I don't think are good people, really good people who tell me that they were forced to work on the campaign for Brandon Johnson.
Yeah.
So machine politics is almost gone in Chicago. It used to be the way it was under Daily One, Daily Two, and whoever came along. But Tony Preckwinkle, the Cook County Commissioner, um, board president, I should say. I think that's her title. She controls the CTU, and Brandon Johnson is her guy.
Yeah.
So what they just did, Pedro Martinez, I don't know the man, but he is the forget the title. He's the head of the school districts here in Chicago. He's hired
Right.
from outside, not from outside Chicago, but outside CTU. And he refused to take a short-term, high-interest loan to give the teachers a raise, which is what the mayor wanted him to do.
Right.
So the mayor wanted him to resign, and he refused to do it. It turns out that the mayor doesn't have the authority to fire him.
Hmm.
They had to get the board, the 6 or 7 person Chicago education board, to vote to fire him. All 7 of them resigned magically. And then Brandon Johnson picked the 7 who were going to fill. And guess what? The first thing they did was they voted to fire Pedro
Martinez.
Martinez.
Right. Right.
So the chicanery of the politics here in Chicago is overwhelming. I don't know the grip that the CTU and SEIU and those other groups that are all affiliated out there have on Chicago. But I'll tell you what, they are loud, and
Yeah.
the squeaky wheel gets the grease. We know that. I mean, look, that's what happened with me. 5 consecutive years, I told you the results. At the time, a 35-year career of achievement. Every place I went, I had results. Every one of those 3 commands that I had in the NYPD as deputy commissioner spanned 2 administrations. That's a rare thing to do. And then I go to Newark. Cory Booker becomes a United States senator based upon what he did about crime, by the way. I don't know if you
Mm.
know that.
I do.
And I
I do.
come
We
out here.
followed it. I saw the documentary.
Oh man, Brick City. That's a dark time in my life. So then I come out here and achieve the same results. And because of the Laquan McDonald shooting, Rahm Emanuel folded.
I remember it. They wanted the tape
And
released and all that.
he could have just stood up and everything would have been fine.
Yeah.
So he asked me to resign, and I told him no. He went out and told the press that I resigned, which was a lie.
Right.
Then every day for 17 days, his chief of staff called me and asked if I was going to resign. And I said, please stop calling. I'm not going to resign. Then on day
Mm.
17, there was a FOIA request for my letter of resignation, which didn't exist.
Right.
So she sent me a letter of termination.
Mm.
Not even Rahm Emanuel,
Yeah. Yeah.
his chief of staff.
Yeah.
So
You could see you could see. Look, I mean, if you follow the news at all, I remember it. You could see very clearly what had happened there,
yeah,
and he was just offering the media ahead. They got the narrative that they wanted. It's the stuff that we talked about. You talk about it enough, you say it enough, it becomes gospel, and God forbid you push back on it. It was very clear
yeah,
what had occurred there, and frankly, Chicago's been paying for it ever since. Realistically, you can start right there. You can start the clock running on the demise of Chicago. So look, I know we're up against a hard out and we're about out of time, but I want to ask you one last question. In light of all of that, I wanted to make today a little bit about you and about your career, but also about Chicago. I know you're still working now. You're at Willow Springs as a chief, But relative to Chicago, which, you don't hear about as much in New York, despite the fact that it's our second city in this country. I am skeptical about where New York is going. Can Chicago come back? Is there any cognizance? I know people who live there. They seem quite resigned to the idea that this is just the way it'll be forever until the place goes out of business. Does Chicago come back?
I believe so. First of all, I love this place, ironically.
Yeah, I've always loved Chicago too, man. To me, it was always like a clean New York.
That's exactly right. It's a great, great place. I absolutely love it. It's like, the downtown is like Manhattan on the water. You know what I
It's
mean?
cool. It is.
So I've been talking about this for a while, that, the politics runs in runs in waves, right?
Sure.
And, for a number of years now, listen, I'm still a Democrat. When I was born and raised in the Bronx,
Yeah. No,
us
Irish Democrats.
firemen,
That's how it
plumbers,
was.
electricians,
Sure.
we were Kennedy Democrats, right? That's what Martha McCallum calls me, Kennedy Democrat.
Yeah.
That party has left me,
Yeah.
but the things that they've done here over the last few years, there's no moderation.
Right.
And my expectation, being a history buff, is that it's going to turn around at some point. And I had the great honor to be in a perfect place and time when Rudy Giuliani came to New York City.
Yeah.
Well, became mayor and
Yeah.
brought in Bill Bratton.
Yeah.
And we went from being reactive to being proactive.
Right.
And then I got to run those programs. So I've seen it, I've been involved in it, and I know it can happen. And I see it happening slowly but surely, certainly in the country now.
Yeah.
President Trump is having a ball with himself.
Yeah.
But some of these things are just such common sense. Signing the issue of men cannot compete with women in sports, biological men.
Yeah.
Who can argue that?
Yeah, I know. I was on the air yesterday. I made that exact point. We've hit a place where we need the top executive in the country to say that men should not be competing against women. I mean,
Yeah.
we're in crazy town now.
Yeah.
You know.
So I believe that we're on the way back.
I
really
hope
do.
you're right. And the reason I am a little skeptical, more than I've been in the past, is because this time around it's been institutionalized. You guys out there in Illinois have the Safety Act, which took all the worst ideas that we have here in New York and institutionalized them in statute in Illinois. They didn't work here, so great, let's put them in Illinois. And New York, the same thing. New York State, I'm talking about now, has passed all of these bail reform measures. And, the NYPD is doing what it can. They're up in arrests. They're going after, we got the new commissioner. She's coming in very strong. She's done a lot of the right things. She made a lot of the right moves. But at the end of the day, these guys, the perps just get out. And, what I'm hearing on the ground is a lot of the units want to go federal. Even, even local state police, they want to take their cases federal because they have more faith in the federal system these days, because under bail reform, these guys are just getting out. I'll give you the last word.
Well, the last thing that I want to say is I'm already starting to see the change. Kim Fox was the state's attorney out here.
Disaster. Yeah.
Handpicked by Tony Preckwinkle for years. And the things that she did are simply unconscionable. I've never heard a prosecutor that leads with her exoneration rate rather than her prosecution rate.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Soros prosecutor.
She just went to leave, and the guy who they were trying to put in lost to Eileen O'Neill Burke, who's a former judge, and she is, as my wife likes to say, no joke. And I believe we're going to see a difference in the prosecutions in Cook County now. I'm hopeful that that's going to happen. I expect that it's going to happen. And maybe that's the start, where we plant the flag, and maybe we could get our society back, because this is mayhem.
If we can end on a good note, the recent polling last week showed that right now the Democratic Party has the lowest approval rating in its history since they've been taking polls, 31%. And those are the people that admit it. It's probably lower. And I think at some point, I think you're right, it's going to have to change because we're losing our cities. Well, I'm going to call you Chief, even though you keep telling me not to. We're going to thank today the former Superintendent of Chicago PD, current Chief of Willow Springs, former NYPD Chief, and top dog in Newark, as well, an illustrious career. We hope you come back and talk to us again. We really appreciate you seeing us, Chief, and Godspeed in everything you're doing.
Thank you so much, Paul. My pleasure, and I'll be back anytime you want me.
You got it. Thanks much. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.